True Ground Housing Partners is one of our premier nonprofit affordable housing developers working here in our region and started in Arlington. You may know them, formerly known as Arlington Partnership for Affordable Housing. They've really grown tremendously under the leadership of Carmen Romero, their CEO, and they just have a fantastic staff who not only works with True Ground, but they also are out there kind of leading on being educators and thought leaders on the topic. So we are really thrilled to have two of their staff members from the real estate team with us today. Brian Goggin, who is a policy and project manager with True Ground. He also serves on Navaja's Leadership Council. So welcome, Brian. And then additionally, we have Charles Sim, who's a director of real estate development. They both have published Substack articles, so we will make sure you have the links to those articles. And really have kind of helped to educate our community on affordable housing financing and operations. So, welcome, Brian. Welcome, Charles. I'm going to go ahead and just turn it right over to you because we have a lot to cover in this hour. Thank you to Hannah, who helped us plan this, and our Navaja team who's here with us today. And welcome. Glad to have you.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Hannah and Jill, for the opportunity to talk about this topic today. So as Jill said, my name is Brian Goggin. I am with True Ground Housing Partners, nonprofit affordable housing owner and developer. I think many of you know us already. But for those who don't, we operate in the DC region. We mainly build subsidized capital A affordable housing using local and federal subsidy programs. My portion of the presentation today will be on development costs and operating costs, how much it costs to build and operate affordable housing. And then I'll hand it over to Charles to talk a little bit more about how we finance projects and how we put together projects. And this presentation is based on two articles that we wrote about the costs of our projects that are on our website. I posted the links in the chat to begin. So if you ever want to reference these, you can. And this is the first time we've kind of done something like this, targeting general communication and education about affordable housing development to a broader external audience. And something we're hoping to build. So we definitely love your feedback. And I think the goal today is to provide general information to housing advocates, housing staff, or elected officials who may be listening, and sort of to communicate the experience of building affordable housing on the ground. So if you find this useful, let's definitely connect after the presentation. I think Charles and I will both share our email addresses. And yeah, and here's an example of what we build on this slide. Some of our projects, mainly ground up, new construction, mid to high rise development across the region. So first, why do we care about costs? Well, I think most of the people on this call can agree we have a housing shortage, especially affordable housing. And so the main goal of housers is one of the main fundamental problems in housing policy is how can we produce more housing? How do we build more housing? And in order to build housing, sources and uses have to meet. And sources are funding and costs, and uses are just costs. In order to build a project, you have to have enough funding to cover the costs. And I think affordable housing advocacy usually focuses on the sources side, the funding side, lobbying and advocating to our state and local and federal elected officials for more tax credits, more housing trust fund dollars. And that's important because the subsidy is really how we are able to meet how we're able to build housing that serves lower income people. But it's, I think, equally important to think about costs, because after all, a dollar saved is the same amount as an additional dollar of subsidy. So it's important to look at both sides of the ledger when you're thinking about how to build more housing. There are also big policy reasons why you can think this is important. We want to make an efficient use of government subsidies. And that also allows us to weather economic downturns more easily, and also maybe some unfavorable political cycles where affordable housing is down across the board. Um, so hopefully today, this presentation will provide you a little bit of a shared understanding of what it takes to build, what it costs to build. And hopefully I can provide you a little bit of a mental map of some of the challenges and policy levers that we can pull to help lower costs. So the context here, this is a cost information from a sample of True Ground projects, all built in the DC area sometime in the last decade or so. 8 of these projects are in Arlington County, 1 is in Fairfax County, and 1 is in the District of Columbia. These are all new construction projects. So they're new built as opposed to rehab of existing buildings. And they share some common building attributes to make them comparable to each other. So they're mainly mid-rise projects, either fully concrete or a concrete podium with wood frame construction. They're all double-loaded corridor, elevator-served buildings with underground parking. And this is a pretty typical type of building in urban infill environments, locations. So a few caveats as well. This is a general overview of some of our costs. It's not a rigorous study of what it costs to build affordable housing. So I think it's a good data point that we provide. But the DC region is a high cost market. So this definitely may not be representative of other markets in the country. And it's of a particular product type, subsidized affordable housing using the low-income housing tax credit program. So there's some particular unique factors in that model of development that contribute to our costs. And these are all costs normalized to $2025, but they're slightly out of date now with projects that have come across in the last year, which have actually seen cost increases mainly. So fairly recent, but just a little bit out of date. So getting right into it, how much does it cost to develop a new building? Top line average numbers for each unit of affordable housing we produce, it costs a little over $500,000. These are split into 3 major buckets: hard costs, soft costs, and acquisition costs. The largest of these buckets is hard costs. And this is the bricks and mortar, more specifically, the contract cost, what we pay the general contractor to build the physical building for the house, to build the housing itself. And that is a little over 2/3 of the cost, development cost. Next is soft costs. These are the non-contractor costs that go into development. Things like designing the building, engineering the building, getting legal approvals for the building, financing the building. And then finally, acquisition costs. This is the cost to buy the land and any existing site infrastructure that may be on the land that we can reuse for the new building. That's just a little under 10% of our average cost. So now we'll delve a little bit into each of these categories individually. First, hard costs. So at True Ground, we break hard costs down in a few ways. This is the main way we do it. Into base building costs and other costs, really. And there are other ways you can break hard costs down. You can break them into specific cost categories like trades, such as framers or MEP trades or interior finishes. That's a lot of work. And frankly, for our study, we didn't do that level of depth. So we separated them into some simpler categories. Basically, the base building costs here, which is a little over $220,000 per unit. This is most of the bricks and mortar of the building. The foundations, framing, concrete, all the subcontractors, basically, masonry, plumbing, mechanical, interior finishes, the building itself. Next, we have parking, which we track separately because we think it's important to track this separately for policy reasons. Virginia Housing, where we mainly work in Virginia, they track this for LIHTC application purposes. But I think it's useful to illustrate just how much parking adds. And this is specifically how we define it. This is the extra cost of excavation and concrete and sheeting and shoring that it takes to build that underground garage. It costs a lot to dig that hole and to pour the concrete for that parking. Just over 10% of the overall costs of hard costs. Um, General conditions and profit next. This is also generally between 10 and 15% of hard costs. This is the overhead for the general contractor itself, and any profit that they make on building the building. Next is site work, just under 20,000 per unit. This is the cost of prepping the site for building, excavating any parts of the site that we need to excavate. Utility relocation includes things like grading, paving, landscaping. This can vary a lot depending on the project, especially with greenfield development sites where we may need to create a new road network or add utility extensions that didn't previously exist at all. And then finally, other fees. The contractor pays insurance, taxes, and bonding fees themselves on every project. So here's a few major drivers across these cost categories that influence construction costs. And I think it's helpful to think about these as advocates, as housing advocates. It's helpful to think about these things in two sort of buckets: things that are outside our control and things that are inside our control. And by our here, I mean really local and state housing staff and developers and elected officials. What's something that like is in our sphere of influence? Generally, things like macroeconomic factors, like national materials costs or labor shortages, are things that are outside of our influence, basically. We'd all love to see tariffs come down, but none of us hold the keys to that particular policy. But there are a lot of things that are in our control that add a lot of costs. These are all listed on the right side of this slide here. First of all, there's local parking mandates. We as a developer, we may want to build parking anyway, but oftentimes local parking mandates are above and beyond what we would build. And this adds a lot of costs, as I explained in the previous slide. There's special hiring requirements, especially with federal dollars, sometimes with local dollars. Davis-Bacon wage scale in particular can add significant costs. We've seen 20 to 30% overall increases of hard costs. So it makes us very wary in accepting federal funds, frankly, where the costs of accepting those funds may outweigh the benefits to the project. There are a lot of design requirements above and beyond what a market rate building might experience. Virginia Housing has, for example, its minimum design and construction requirements. This is like a 40-page document of requirements that we have to meet. It gets way into the weeds of light fixtures, slope of the building, the materials on the outside of the building that we can use and can't use. And this makes it more expensive to build. There are environmental and green requirements that can add significant costs. These are at the state and local level. Localities oftentimes add their own special green requirements. Things like adding like solar panels on a building usually are six-figure cost increases at a minimum. Procurement requirements. I know we've all heard of BABA recently, Build America. I actually don't know what it stands for. Buy America, Build America. There are local site plan conditions that are approved as a condition of rezoning. Things like undergrounding utilities, replacing traffic lights, stormwater detention centers, replacing trees, that add a lot of costs. And finally, building codes. All of our buildings in Virginia and in other states follow some form of the International Building Code, which actually has a funny name. It's ironic that it's called international because it's mainly just the US and Canada that use it. And these are mainly state and locally controlled. And these include a lot of outdated provisions that make housing more costly to build. One example I like to cite is that elevators cost about 3 times as much in the US as in Europe because of our uniquely expensive requirements on how big they can be and how much they're regulated. So I think, these extra requirements all uh, have their own separate policy goals outside of housing that they're trying to accomplish. But I think it's important to consider the trade-offs in adding these requirements. How much do we increase the cost of affordable housing, and is it worth it to accomplish these other unrelated policy goals? Um, so getting into soft costs now, there are a number of major subcategories. The first of these is most expensive is developer fee. There are dozens of staff on our side that touch the project. It's not just the development team. We also have an extensive asset management staff, and we have to pay their salaries. They manage the project throughout its life cycle, and they have a lot of admin expenses to oversee the project. And we also use this for some pre-development spending for future projects. And some of this developer fee is deferred, commonly deferred in the form of a loan. And we take some of that payment as cash flow from the property. Next, financing fees. Affordable housing has a uniquely complicated capital stack. There are usually 5 to 10 lenders or investors on every project, and they all have their own legal fees, their own processing fees, their own compliance fees. Next, architecture and engineering, actually designing the building itself, you might be surprised to hear, is only about 25,000 per unit. It actually is much smaller than some other categories. And this also includes architecture supervision during the construction process. Next, we have permitting. We have to pay fees to the local government to review our building plans so that they can ensure that they pass muster for local safety and habitable standards. The local government also adds a lot of proffer conditions, special proffer conditions on our project, things like public art requirements or additional transportation management fees. We have special traffic and environmental studies we have to do. And we also have to pay property taxes during construction, and that's included in the development budget. Next, we have reserves that we budget for to make sure that while we're leasing up the building, there's sufficient funds to operate the building, where there may not be enough rental income at first. There's legal, accounting, and insurance fees during construction. And also at the beginning of the project, when we're approving the project, there's a special land use council we usually have to hire. And finally, there's marketing and lease-up fees, appraisal and market studies. So that was a lot of soft cost categories, but there are a few major factors across these categories that we think drive soft costs higher. The biggest ones that we see are financing complexity. In the US, we have an extremely fragmented system of funding affordable housing between multiple layers of government and multiple private entities and public entities. And every one of these entities wants to leverage the other entities. And this means that we typically have a lot of different funding sources on every project. Every one of these projects, as I described, I just described, they have separate loan docs, separate terms, compliance monitoring fees. That adds costs. Next is discretionary zoning approval. Most of the places where we try to build housing, actually on paper, they aren't zoned for apartments. So we have to go through a complicated and expensive rezoning process to approve our buildings. That means we have to hire a land use council to guide us through that process. We have to usually do multiple redesigns of the project during that process, and that adds costs. Special consultant studies. We have a certain level of risk and unpredictability with that process, and what local governments can really require things in an open-ended fashion, such as proffer conditions. And finally, permitting can add costs as well. Our plans are reviewed by dozens of local agencies. There are oftentimes overlapping comments between different agencies within local government. It's not just the building department. There's also the housing department, environmental review. There's emergency services like firefighters and police that review our plans. So this requires extra coordination from our engineers, architects, and government staff as well. Okay, um, that's it for development costs. Now operating costs. So why do operating costs matter? Well, just like development costs, operating costs influence how much new housing we can build, mainly because if you have lower operating costs, that means more of the rent can be used to support debt. And the more debt you have, the less subsidy you need to build housing. We typically maximize the amount of debt that we can support when we're constructing a capital stack for our project. But there are other things you can do if operating costs are lower with that extra money. You can use it to serve lower incomes, supporting the same amount of debt, but with less rent because operating costs are lower. And you can even do other things like fund repairs so that you don't have as much of you don't need as heavy of a subsidy later down the line when you're recapitalizing the project uh, to renovate it. Operating costs, what do they look like? This is on a per month average on a per month basis. They're about $847 per month. There are a number of subcategories here. Utility expenses, we pay all the common area utility expenses. Our renters usually pay their own unit utilities. Admin expenses, we have a third-party property management company, office supplies, accounting, legal fees, maintenance and cleaning services, taxes. We pay property taxes just like any other property owner, and that's very expensive. And we also pay general liability insurance. Finally, we pay payroll. Usually there are between 2 to 4 staff members, depending on the size of the building, full-time at each property. And they manage things like leasing, move-ins, move-outs. It's a very demanding job that requires good pay. Here's a basic income statement to put this sort of in context. Our operating expenses, you can see the 847 from the previous slide just here. The typical rent for a 1 bedroom in one of our buildings. Operating expenses are only one part of the operating costs that we pay with rent. The other two are our capital reserves. We set a little bit of money aside every month. This is $25 here for future capital expenses. But the other big cost that we use rent to pay for is our mortgage payment. And we have to pay this every month because we took out a big loan to build the building. And so you can see the remaining cash flow, $140 every month, is actually a very small percentage of the rent we take in. And so, this also just shows why rent is so important in a functioning affordable housing system. Because we need it to pay our debt service, we need to pay our operating expenses to operate the building. A few key drivers of operating expenses across the board that we see. The higher the cost of living is for our staff, the higher payroll is. So we really need more market rate housing as well to ease the housing shortage, especially near and places where they work. Insurance costs, we've seen 10 to 15% increases in the past few years since COVID. This has been mainly for major natural disasters that have happened elsewhere in the country. But there are a few unique reasons why LIHTC properties have high insurance costs. Per the tax code, we cannot require renters insurance without offsetting rent discounts, whereas most market rate buildings can just require renters insurance. So that liability usually falls more on our property than it does in market rate buildings. Property taxes are a large portion of our operating expenses. And until this year, hopefully, there's a state bill to change this, hopefully, but Virginia localities cannot exempt affordable housing from property taxes like other states. Just like compliance increases costs in development, it also increases costs in operations because our property management staff has to collect and report uh, information for each financing source uh, to make sure we're in compliance with those programs. And finally, utilities is a pretty expensive line item. One thing that's been driving this recently is the increased expectation that affordable housing property owners provide free high-speed internet for all the residents. And this is pretty expensive to do, 20,000 or more per year in one of our properties. Um, and that just wraps it up for me. I'll just share a few other good resources on costs that I've found. The Turner Center is great, mainly California based. The last nationwide study of LIHTC costs that I'm aware of. The Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies does great work on multifamily development costs. And finally, Construction Physics is a great blog if you're not already reading it. Provides some deep dives into why it's so hard to bring down construction costs in the country. So, Charles, do you want to go next?
Absolutely. Thank you, Bryant. Right. Okay. So let me see if I can share now. All right, there we go. Can you all see my screen? Perfect. All right. So I will try to keep it quick so we can get to Q&A. I saw a lot of stuff popping off and going on in the chat. All right, so the tale of two buildings. Let's talk about it. So Brian laid out some really great context around cost of building, and here's where it translates into the financing side. So if we look at two buildings, this is a hypothetical 100-unit building that costs right about $50 million or $500,000 a unit to build. Let's keep the math simple. All right, so in that, we now have a restricted rent of, let's say, $2,000 a month and a market rate rent of, let's say, $5,000 a month. We're keeping expenses the same. They're going to be very high here, 12,500 a unit versus the numbers Ryan just shared. And so that produces a very different net operating income. And with that, that produces a very different value of the building. So under this scenario where we have a $50 million development cost, we have a $95 million value for a market rate building and a $23 million value for the affordable building. But with a $23 million value for the affordable building, it creates an issue for us. And that is we now have a financing gap. So for affordable developers, a lot of what we're trying to do once we identify what the cost of a building may be is figure out how in the world do we solve these gaps. So what are the tools for that? So one of the core tools is debt, as Brian touched on earlier. So the way that we size loans, right, is not based off of just what we need, because like obviously we need $50 million in the previous example. No, we size it based off what the building can afford. And the building can afford, and so affordable housing has artificially constrained rents, right? We set those rent limits so that they are affordable to folks who have under at or under a certain AMI level. But what that does is it reduces the size of debt that we can yield, and then that creates is part of what creates a gap. And so so in order to do this, we have the low-income housing tax credit. And so the low-income housing tax credit is the national tool for affordable housing. It's the most used tool to create affordable housing in the nation. It involves taking the cost of the housing to create basis, which we then turn into credits, and that we're able to sell to investors, where they're able to take a write down on their taxes over a period of about 10 years. So just to touch on the tool, and then that tool comes in two different forms, the 4% and the 9% um, here. So I'm going to take a moment on this slide for just a bit. So when we look at affordable housing, and the 4 and the 9, what we're looking at is two separate things, right? What we're looking at is a different value of the credit. So the 9% is a competitive credit. So worth roughly around 70% of the value of the value of the basis of for what you're getting for the credits. The 4% is worth roughly about 30%. And so we have different amounts of debt that we can put on it. Shucks, losing my structure here. Okay. So with the senior debt or with the 9%, we tend to have a stack that's roughly about 10 to 20% debt 70% equity, and then 10 to 20% subordinate funds. And so subordinate funds tend to be funds from counties, local jurisdictions, states, etc., that we work with. For 4% bonds, it tends to be about 40 to 50% debt, 30% equity, and roughly 20 to 30% subordinate funds. So let's just take a quick moment and like touch on that. So why? So usually with the competitive 9%, in order to meet the requirements for the state, you tend to provide a higher level of affordability to meet whatever requirements the state might be looking for in that particular year, QAP or qualified allocation plan. For the 4% credits, usually those are non-competitive, and so you're able to get those with an allocation of bonds. And what that does is it says is we're able to have a higher rent limit, which allows us to charge more. We're able to then target higher AMI levels, which allow us to charge more rent, which gives us a higher NOI, allows us to take on more debt. So it kind of traces back. So where developers spend the bulk of their time is we identify the amount of debt we can hold. We know which kind of tax credit we may be applying for. So once we identify and size our debt and we're able to size our equity, then we have to figure out how do we put this puzzle together of solving for subordinate financing. So there are a number of tools, right? And a lot of them have different trade-offs. So certain tools, as Brian touched on earlier, like federal funds, et cetera, may come with different compliance requirements or restrictions that may make it more difficult to build housing or, tougher. So, or increase the cost, right? So it all kind of translates back to the cost to build and the cost to operate the housing. So we approach a lot of folks, different state governments and sources, local government sources or housing incentive funds, tax abatements if the state allows those, all to basically get to the point where either we're reducing the operating costs, which will allow us to bring more sources to the table, or we're bringing actual sources to the table for the construction of housing, like a, like direct investing or lending. We have federal sources, so there's home, there's CDBG, there's others, etc. And then there's also mission aligned impact funds that we work with. So there's a lot of issues. There's a lot of different programs that happen. And so I think one thing I thought might be interesting to discuss or share with this group is how do we think about it from a developer, right? Like, okay, you can size this thing, you can compete in the QAPs or for the financing applications, and the question becomes, how do we then go about doing that? So we kind of will have an idea which projects we're going to take through certain milestones at one point or into financing, and then once if we're able to win credits or we're going to compete in fours, we then look around at what are the different financing sources available in the given jurisdiction. And so, based on what's available, we'll then sort of try to time and say, okay, well, we have an idea that this program may be offered or that program may be offered. And so, what you'll see is that affordable housing is a direct result of like public support for housing. And really, developers sort of line up and go in the process of where government is. The way I like to think about it is we are all part of the process of creating a community benefit, and that housing is a broad community benefit, and we're being responsive to our local partners and our public partners in terms of how we want to where their vision is for a community and us aligning with that to deliver housing. So we track state QAPs, we track, housing finance authorities, we see where funds might be going, where there might be bonds, whatever the incentives are. Um, we we go to those jurisdictions, we apply for different funding programs, we pay attention to notice of funding availabilities or NOFAs. We map local incentives, right? Those change sometimes at the state or the county or city level, and we work with those departments to see what their needs are in a given period of time. And with that, touching on it, so the public sector is really the driving force behind affordable housing, right? And us as developers are responding to those public incentives, responding to that, but developers are going to go where the funds are, right? So if you wonder why is affordable housing happening in one jurisdiction and not another, or what can we do to incentivize a different type of housing? our role is to be responsive to the incentives that are put in place and to the development that's put in place and be responsive to the community. So the real question is how can we work together as partners and put policy into practice to prioritize the things that we want to see in the community and then respond to it. So I just wanted to hone this as the thought of this as being a really collaborative approach in terms of the way we view housing at True Ground and the way we operate and work with our local jurisdictions. So, um, so there's a whole section. So this was based on in part by a Substack that I put out a few months ago, maybe a year ago at this point. Anyway, but it was just talking about, the affordable housing as a public investment and that understanding sort of that process and how we work to it as a um, as a developer for the community broadly. So I think this is my contact info in the Substack, and I think Jill's going to send this out. Jill and Hannah will send this out later, and that's it. So we'll get to questions. Didn't want to. I knew we were running out of time.
No, that was amazing. Thank you so much, Brian and Charles. Thank you for really explaining what is a very complicated topic, putting it in a format that we can kind of digest. But you did see we have quite a few questions in the chat, so really welcome you to add other questions. And we'll just kind of take the remaining time that we have to try to clarify some of your points. So we will be sending out the recording, the slides, and the Substack links for both Brian and Charles's articles are in the chat as well. So please take advantage of those. All right, so questions. We had a few questions about Davis-Bacon. So I don't know, Brian, if you want to talk about that. So the question was first, if the per unit price tag that you had in your study was based on your actual cost of total development costs in Virginia. I think that was maybe your whole portfolio, but if you can clarify that. And then talking about Davis-Bacon and if you consider Davis-Bacon to be part of what you can control or you cannot control. And then there was another Davis-Bacon question about that 23% increase that Brian mentioned. Was that just from the last year? And if you were, what that timeline of the increase you referred to was, I think you mentioned 23% increase.
Sure. I think maybe there's a misunderstanding. The 20 to 30% is a premium of Davis-Bacon compared to projects without Davis-Bacon. So it doesn't refer to an increase in a time sense. So specifically projects that we've had to use Davis-Bacon with federal funds, we see maybe like 650 a door in TDs in total development costs, as opposed to the more standard 500 per door in TDCs. Davis-Bacon increases the actual costs of the labor, but it also increases compliance costs on the contractor side. That increases our general conditions. So there are a number of avenues through which Davis-Bacon adds costs. Does that answer one of the questions?
I think that does. Just to follow up, in the study that you did, was the per unit price tag and the analysis based on your costs of total development costs in just Virginia projects or your whole portfolio? So that would be Maryland and DC as well.
Yeah, so the first, I think it was like the second or third slide I showed, talked a little bit about the sample. It's 10 projects of like the same kind of project type that we sort of chose because they were similar projects. But they're mostly in Virginia, but not all in Virginia. One of them is in DC. So
Great. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, moving on. You had the per cost unit for the slide about the soft costs and had referenced a $25,394 price tag for architecture and engineering. Somebody was curious if that was per unit or if that was spread across multiple units, but I think that was a per unit cost from your slide.
Yes, per unit.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
We
Great.
typically see like a typical contract for an architect is like $2 to $3 million on a project. So depending on the size of the project, you can do the math. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And can you talk a little bit about resident utilities, how they're measured, how they're calculated? And I know that probably depends on the project, but if you could talk a little bit about how True Ground typically does measures the different utilities for a resident.
Yeah. So um all of our resident we pay standard rates for utilities that come from Dominion. We pay Dominion Energy just like anybody else would pay Dominion Energy for their electricity in Virginia, if you're in Virginia. We pay Washington Gas for gas. If anybody uses gas, we pay typical Xfinity, Comcast rates, and so do our residents. We pay the typical water and sewer fees that anybody else pays. Um, Most of our residents pay their own utilities. The exception to that is trash, which we provide, in a common area utilities, which we pay. Um, there's a special thing in affordable housing though, where if your residents are paying their own utilities for their unit, you have to deduct that cost from their rent. It's called a utility allowance. So we do that. It's part of the tax credit program. And the amount that would deduct from their rents is determined by HUD in the federal government, and Virginia Housing. So you can look those up online. Does
Great.
that help?
Yep. No, I think that helped. Thank you so much. And if it didn't help, feel free to add additional clarifying question in the chat. I'm going to go through actually just kind of the explainers, people asking for more clarification about what you presented, and then we'll kind of come back to the bigger picture questions about how you might change the program or different policies that you're tracking, zoning policies. So, on the slide about the financing gap, that was estimated to be $27 million. The projections for market rate and affordable rate buildings were
Sure.
calculated with a 5% increase. And what does that 5% refer to? I think that was
So
your
yeah, that was
follow-up.
projected with a
Mhm.
5 cap rate. So that was
Okay.
literally just using an assumption to get a value. We could have used a 6 or a 10. It was for example purposes.
Yeah, can you just maybe do a quick explainer of what a cap rate
Oh,
is?
I
Yeah. No,
apologize.
no, no. That would be great. That would be great.
No
To,
worries.
yeah.
We'll go
Mhm.
back to real estate finance class. All right.
Yes.
So a cap rate is a capitalization rate. Just very simply to you take the income that a property produces. You divide that by a rate or capitalization rate, which is, that could be what properties sell for in the area. You can base it on a lot of things. Anyway, and then what did you get out of that is the value. So you take the income divided by the rate, and that gives you a value. And that is how we determine the value for the hypothetical market rate building and the hypothetical affordable building.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that.
Sure.
I really appreciate it. Can you talk a little bit about if True Ground has done this or any other of the local developers build a mix of low income and market rate buildings, or maybe the question is if you build both market rate and affordable in one building, and how you take that, how True Ground evaluates that calculus of whether or not you would do a mixed income property, a mixed income building.
Sure. So True Ground focuses on 100% affordable developments. It's our mission, and that's what we're here to do. We do have some unrestricted units in our portfolio, most of which we tend to operate as affordable. We do have a mixed income building, and there are jurisdictions that have more interest in mixed income. So that's something we have explored, but we're primarily and we try to stay focused on 100% affordable communities.
That's great.
Um,
Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
yeah, Charles, can I add a little bit to that?
Please,
I'll just
please.
say I think mixed income development is a really promising model for the future. Um, it's not something like Charles said, it's not something that we do, but I think it's becoming increasingly common. you might be familiar with Montgomery County, Maryland, who their Housing Opportunities Commission, the public developer, public housing agency there builds a lot of mixed income development, and that's how they fund a lot of their new public housing. Um, and obviously, the big difference with mixed income is, there's less subsidy needed if you're including market rate income in a project. You can cross subsidize. Um, and there are a number of states that are introducing revolving loan funds for mixed income development across the country. So I think that's really important. Yeah, I think I see a question in the chat. Can you recommend some mixed income developers and operate nationwide? Um, Montgomery County HOC. I'll also just mention the Center for Public Enterprise, which is basically the leading think tank on mixed income development. And they have a bunch of resources on this.
Great resource.
Uh,
Yeah, we'll try to get that website up for you, and that could be an interesting future lunch and learn topic. So to talk about mixed income development. So I appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, other clarifying questions. Can you combine the 4% and 9% low income housing tax credit within the same development?
So I can take this, Brian. Yes, we can. You can, and we do it all the time. Those are commonly referred to as twinning or hybrid developments. So a number of the projects, developments Brian would have used in his study were both 4 and 9% buildings, and we've done plenty of those in Virginia.
That's great. Thank you. When you're thinking about affordable housing at different scales, do you see those per unit costs come down with the economy of scale as projects get higher in units? Is there a point where those savings per unit diminish in your experience? And if there's a sweet spot for project size, like 150 or 250 units, or does it depend on other factors?
that's a good question. We haven't really done an in-depth study of that. Um, I think some of our lowest, we tend to have economies of scale in bigger projects, especially not just with hard costs, but with admin cost, regulatory costs. We can spread those over much more units in bigger projects. But we have seen that high rise, like very big projects, do have larger construction costs as well. Um, so I think the sweet spot is 150 to 200 units, in my opinion. And I also say, like in the LIHTC model of development, there's so much like time and effort needed to apply for the funding for one of these buildings that it doesn't work with a small apartment building really below 100 units. Like we have to have sufficient scale to justify paying our staff and time. And just the QAPs in the various states, they incentivize mid-rise, a minimum of like a mid-rise apartment building.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Can you talk about that revolving loan fund, Brian, that you mentioned for mixed income projects?
Sure. I mean, I'm not an expert on this, so I really encourage you to look at the Center for Public Enterprise for more details. Um, but my understanding is like housing finance agencies, some HFAs across the country they have a big backup of affordable housing projects that can't get funding because there's not enough funding. So instead, what they're doing is they are investing, they're making some of these projects partly partly market rate to help close the gap. And they're investing some of their HFA dollars, some of their public dollars by creating the form of these funds differs from state to state, but they create a revolving loan fund. They put some public money into it and then with the money, they have some terms of getting money back from the projects once they finish. And the idea is to have a self-sustaining revolving loan fund that they can use to build more affordable housing. But the key is the mix, the market rate portion is key because that's how they can build the housing without additional subsidy dollars.
Yep, that was a great explainer. Yeah, I really encourage you to look in the chat for the Center for Public Enterprise, and then Montgomery County HOC has a local program as well. That was actually the topic of our Lucky Forum last year. So, okay, so kind of bigger picture questions coming at you. This is a good one, I think. What is the single highest impact thing that a local government can do to attract builders like True Ground? Is it gap financing, zoning change, or something else?
Charles, maybe I'll go first. I think affordable housing, it's gap funding. Um, Overall housing, it's zoning. Um, and to a lesser extent, permitting. Just making it as easy as possible to build. Um, I think zoning is the number one barrier to that. And of course, for affordable specific, we need the gap fund. Not only do we need the gap fund to fund the project, but we need the gap funding to be competitive for the state funds.
Yes, you get a higher score if you have that local support, that local investment from your jurisdiction.
Yeah. And I think Brian said it perfectly. The only thing I would just add is that should have an understanding of timing and collaboration, right? It's very collaborative. It takes a very long time to do this. So we like to start working with local partners early and figure out, what folks' needs are and work with them through all the processes Brian just laid out.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, if you had a magic wand, I'll ask both of you this, Brian and Charles. How would you improve the low-income housing tax credit program? Do you have any suggestions for improvement if you were in charge?
Charles, you want to go first? I guess I can try
Sure.
and
I
answer it.
think if I had a magic wand, I would make it a lot less complex and probably convert it from a tax credit to some sort of grant and drop a massive amount of complexity out of the process.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar. In an ideal world, we wouldn't fund affordable housing through the tax code like we do now. I think that the basic fundamental design of LIHTC is what creates the complexity. It's, a tax credit that is bought by investors, and then there's a whole series of lawyers that get involved. There's bonds. It doesn't cover the full cost of the building, so you have to seek out state and local funding as well. So I guess if I had a magic wand, I would empower a public agency to build the housing, to fund it and build it. And that would remove a lot of inefficiencies lost to legal and regulatory costs. Now, like we don't live in a world where it's politically feasible to build housing that way. LIHTC exists because that's the thing that Republicans and Democrats can agree on to fund affordable housing, to be frank. So,
Well said. Okay, circling back to special zoning or local incentives, what are you tracking? Are there any specific zoning that you track, Brian? I know you spend a lot of time on state legislation and local as well. Is there something that you think would really move the needle on? I know there's housing supply and also affordable housing, but a housing supply we'll talk about.
um, yeah. Wait, was the question specifically about zoning
Well,
and
it
land?
wasn't specific, but yeah, like the question was just what zoning or incentives are you tracking? Is true ground.
Um, yeah, well, so in Virginia specifically, there's a bill that's going to enable local governments to exempt affordable housing from property taxes. I think that's going to be real, has a lot of potential to impact housing production. Of course, like that's just another form of subsidy in a way. So it's not going to solve all problems. Zoning is also another big thing. I think so there's a number of state bills in Virginia now that have passed or waiting for the governor's signature now that can help zoning. There's a faith and housing bill that will make it easier to build on faith-owned land. There's a parking mandate reform bill. Um, there's a manufactured housing bill. Just cutting red tape and permitting and zoning. So I'm really hopeful for those. And it's part of a larger nationwide movement that has really taken up storm for land use reform in state houses across the country. So I'm excited by that momentum.
That's great. Okay, we just have like 1 minute. So any final words? I really just want to thank both Brian and Charles for a fantastic presentation and letting those of us who don't live in the development space just kind of gain a better understanding of how these deals come together, are financed and operated. So thank you, but try to know Brian or Charles if you have any final words or statements you want to share.
I just want to say thank you all and really appreciate being able to be here. Brian.
Um, Thank you all. This is really complicated and there's a lot to this. So happy to follow up on anything people want.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all again. Next month's Lunch and Learn, stay tuned for the date and the speakers, but we will be trying to do a Virginia General Assembly legislative wrap up to talk about the housing bills that did pass. As you know, Governor Spanberger has until April 13th to decide to amend or veto or pass that legislation. The budget is still pending, so a lot happening that Brian mentioned on the state level. And we're so grateful for you joining us today. We really appreciate it. Thank you again, Brian and Charles. You are amazing presenters. Thanks for sharing your knowledge with us.